taken from Welsh Fields, Wales, 1976. It was just another ordinary evening on our Welsh farm back in '76. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been nearly 50 years. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct smell of autumn, a mix of damp earth and the last stubborn leaves clinging to the trees. I was going through my usual routine, making my final rounds before turning in for the night. The sheep were all accounted for, nestled together in the far corner of the field, their gentle bleating a comforting backdrop to the encroaching darkness. As I approached the barn to close it up, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. At first I dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on me. After all, farming isn't for the faint of heart, and I'd been up since before dawn. But as I turned to give it a proper look, my heart nearly stopped. There, hovering above, the field where my sheep grazed during the day, was a set of lights unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They weren't the warm yellow glow of our farmhouse windows, nor the harsh beam of a flashlight. These lights pulsed with an otherworldly blue-green hue, casting an eerie glow across the normally peaceful pasture. My first rational thought was that it must be a helicopter. Perhaps someone had gotten lost in the hills and called for help. But as I stood there, frozen in place, I realized that couldn't be right. The lights moved with a fluidity that no man-made machine could replicate. And the silence, oh, the silence was deafening. No chopper blades cutting through the air, no engine roar, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that seemed to swallow up even the ambient sounds of the night. Curiosity got the better of me. I know now that I should have run, should have locked myself in the house and called for help. But in that moment, all I could think about was getting a closer look. My feet carried me forward almost of their own accord, each step taking me further from the safety of the barn and closer to whatever it was that hovered above my field. As I approached, the atmosphere around me began to change. It was subtle. At first, a slight pressure in my ears like descending in an airplane. But with each step, it intensified. The air grew thick, almost syrupy, making it harder to move. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch, everything stopped. The gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant bark of our neighbors, dog, even the sound of my own labored breathing, all of it vanished in an instant. I stood there, enveloped in a bubble of absolute silence, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break this unnatural stillness. But my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I had become a statue, rooted to the spot by some unseen force. And then I felt it. A tugging sensation, starting in the eye pit of my stomach and quickly spreading throughout my body. It wasn't painful, not exactly, but it was the most unsettling thing I've ever experienced. I felt myself beginning to rise, my feet leaving the ground as easily as if gravity had simply decided to take a break. Panic set in then, raw and primal. I tried to yell, to call out for my wife, for anyone who might hear me, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember is looking down at my boots, still firmly planted on the ground, as the rest of me was, pulled upward into that pulsing, otherworldly light. What happened next is, well, it's a blank. A void in my memory that I've spent decades trying to fill. One moment I was being lifted off my own property by some inexplicable force, and the next, I was waking up in my bed, as if the events of the night before had been nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it had been real. The evidence was all over me, quite literally. As I came to, I became aware of a gritty sensation all over my skin. I was covered in dirt, as if I'd spent the night rolling around in one of the fields. The sheets were a mess, caked with mud and grass stains. My wife, bless her, was beside herself. She told me, her voice shaking, that she'd been up all night looking for me. She'd called the neighbors, searched every inch of our property, even ventured out onto the moors with a flashlight. But there had been no trace of me anywhere. And yet, here I was, turning up in our bed, as if I'd been there all along. I tried to explain what had happened, about the lights and the strange force that had lifted me off the ground, but even as the words left my mouth, I could see the doubt in her eyes. It sounded crazy, I knew that. Hell, if someone had told me the same story, I'd have thought they were off their rocker too. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something profound, something beyond my understanding had occurred. As I stumbled out of bed, my whole body aching as if I'd run a marathon, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. My work boots, the ones I'd been wearing when I went to close up the barn, were sitting neatly by the front door, exactly where I'd left them before the incident. It was as if I'd simply walked in, taken them off, and gone to bed like any other night. But that wasn't possible. I remembered seeing those boots on the ground as I was being lifted up. The contradiction made my head spin, and I had to sit down on the edge of the bed to keep from falling over. My wife, bless her heart, was still talking, asking me questions I couldn't begin to answer. Where had I been? Why hadn't I answered when she called? How did I end up in bed without her noticing? I wished I had answers for her, but the truth was, I was just as confused and frightened as she was. As I sat there trying to make sense of what had happened, I noticed an odd sensation on my left forearm. It was a sort of tingling, almost like the feeling you get when your foot falls asleep, but localized to a small area about the size of a penny. Curious, I rolled up my sleeve to take a look. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, just beneath the skin, was a small, metallic object. It wasn't immediately obvious. You had to look closely to see the slight discoloration and the unnatural way the skin seemed to bulge ever so slightly. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. I prodded at it gently with my finger, half expecting it to be painful, but it wasn't. It just felt wrong, foreign, like it didn't belong there. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and disbelief. My wife insisted we go to the doctor to have my arm examined. I was reluctant at first. What could I possibly tell them? That I thought aliens had abducted me and implanted something in my arm. But she was persistent, and eventually I gave in. The look on the doctor's face when he examined my arm is something I'll never forget. It was a mixture of confusion, fascination, and just a hint of fear. He ran test after test, took x-rays, even called in a colleague for a second opinion. But in the end, they were as baffled as I was. The object was there, clear as day on the x-rays, but they couldn't explain what it was or how it had gotten there. It wasn't any kind of medical implant they were familiar with, and there was no scar or entry wound to suggest how it had been inserted. The doctor suggested surgery to remove it, but something held me back. A gut feeling, I suppose you could call it. Whatever this thing was, it was a piece of evidence. Proof that what had happened to me was real, not just some vivid hallucination. I couldn't bring myself to let them take it out, not until I had some answers. Of course, those answers weren't exactly forthcoming. I spent countless nights poring over books about UFOs and alien encounters, searching for something, anything, that might explain what had happened to me. I even reached out to a few UFO research groups, but most of them seemed more interested in sensationalizing my story than actually helping me understand it. It was frustrating, to say the least. Here, I was living proof that there was something out there beyond our understanding, and yet I felt more alone than ever. As the weeks turned into months and then years, life on the farm continued. But nothing was ever quite the same. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the night sky for those eerie lights. Every unexplained sound, every shadow that seemed just a bit too dark, set my heart racing. My wife tried to be understanding, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. The man she had married, the steady, practical farmer, had been replaced by someone jumpy and paranoid. We rarely talked about that night anymore, but it hung between us like an unspoken weight. The implant in my arm remained a constant reminder of my experience. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, I swore I could feel it pulse, as if it were trying to communicate. I'd lie awake, my mind racing with questions. What was its purpose? Was it monitoring me, tracking me, or was it something else entirely, something beyond my comprehension? I tried to go about my daily life. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound or shadow. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, plagued as I was by vivid nightmares that left me drenched in sweat and gasping for air. In these dreams, I was back in that field, surrounded by blinding light and strange, undulating shapes that seemed to defy the laws of physics. I'd wake up with my heart racing, the taste of metal in my mouth, and an overwhelming sense of dread that would linger for hours. My wife, bless her heart, tried her best to understand, but I could see the worry etched on her face every time she looked at me. I knew she was concerned about my mental state, and truthfully, so was I. There were moments when I questioned my own sanity, wondering if perhaps I had suffered some kind of breakdown that night in the field. But then I'd catch a glimpse of that small, silvery object beneath my skin, and I'd be reminded that whatever had happened to me was all too real. I found myself becoming obsessed with UFO sightings and alien abduction stories, spending hours poring over books and articles, desperate to find some confirmation that I wasn't alone in my experience. Every account I read sent chills down my spine as I recognized elements of my own encounter in the stories of others. The lost time, the inexplicable physical evidence, the lingering sense of having been fundamentally changed by the experience. It was all there, echoing my own tale in ways that both comforted and terrified me. About a month after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to see a doctor about the strange implant in my arm. I'd been hesitant to seek medical help, afraid of being labeled as crazy or worse yet, having my experience dismissed entirely. But the constant ache and occasional sharp pains radiating from the site of the implant had become too much to bear. The local GP, a man I'd known for years, listened to my story with a mix of skepticism and concern. I could see him struggling to maintain his professional composure as I recounted the events of that night, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing moment. When I showed him the small, raised bump on my forearm, his expression shifted from doubt to genuine puzzlement. He ran his fingers over the area, pressing gently, before deciding that we needed to take a closer look. The X-ray results left us both stunned. There, clear as day on the film, was a small metallic object nestled beneath my skin. It was unlike anything the doctor had ever seen before. Not quite a chip, not quite a traditional implant, but something other. Its edges were smooth and rounded, with no signs of surgical insertion. It was as if the object had simply materialized within my flesh. The doctor's face paled as he studied the image, and I could almost see the rational, scientific part of his mind warring with the evidence before his eyes. He muttered something about needing to consult with colleagues about running more tests, but I could tell he was as unsettled by the discovery as I was. For the first time since that night, I had tangible proof that my experience wasn't just a figment of my imagination. But rather than providing relief, this confirmation only deepened my sense of unease. What exactly had been done to me during those missing hours, and more importantly, why? The following weeks were a blur of medical appointments, tests, and increasingly invasive questions. Word had somehow gotten out about the mysterious implant, and suddenly I found myself at the center of a storm of attention I neither wanted nor was prepared for. Researchers from universities I'd never heard of reached out, eager to study the object in my arm. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists flooded my mailbox with letters, some offering support, others demanding answers I didn't have. The constant scrutiny was exhausting, and I found myself retreating further into isolation, trusting only my wife and a handful of close friends. The worst part was the feeling of violation that never seemed to fade. Every time I looked at my arm, every time I felt that faint ache where the implant sat, I was reminded of how utterly helpless I had been that night. My body, my very existence, had been intruded upon by something I couldn't begin to understand. The farm, once my sanctuary, now felt tainted. Every night as darkness fell, I'd find myself staring out at that field, half expecting to see those eerie lights return. I installed floodlights, set up cameras, did everything I could to make myself feel secure, but deep down, I knew that if they wanted to come back for me, there was little I could do to stop them. This realization ate away at me, eroding my sense of safety and autonomy. I began to see the world differently, to question everything I thought I knew about reality and our place in the universe. The implant in my arm was a constant reminder that there were forces at work beyond our comprehension, entities capable of reaching down and plucking us from our lives on a whim. And perhaps the most terrifying thought of all was this: what if they weren't finished with me yet? As months passed, I found myself grappling with an increasing sense of paranoia. Every unexplained noise, every flickering light, every passing aircraft became a potential threat. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I could hear the low hum of that otherworldly craft hovering just outside our bedroom window. My wife, bless her, tried her best to comfort me, but I could see the toll my obsession was taking on her. The strain in her eyes, the hesitation in her touch. It was clear she was struggling to reconcile the man I had become with the one she had married. I couldn't blame her. There were days when I hardly recognized myself. The once jovial farmer, who'd laugh and joke with his neighbors, had been replaced by a jumpy, suspicious shell of a man. I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in windows or mirrors and be startled by the gaunt, haunted face staring back at me. Dark circles had taken up permanent residence under my eyes, and my skin had taken on a sickly pallor from spending so much time indoors, afraid to venture out into the open where I might be vulnerable to another encounter. The implant in my arm became both my obsession and my torment. I'd spend hours examining it, pressing and prodding at the skin, trying to decipher its purpose. Was it tracking me, monitoring me, changing me in some subtle, insidious way? I'd lie awake at night, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. And always there was that nagging question. Why me? What made me special, or cursed, enough to be chosen for this experience? About 6 months after the incident, something happened that shook me to my core. I was out in the barn, tending to the sheep, one of the few tasks I still felt comfortable doing given the enclosed space and familiar surroundings. As I was spreading fresh hay, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my arm, right where the implant was located. It was unlike anything I'd experienced before, not the dull ache I'd grown accustomed to, but a searing white-hot sensation that brought me to my knees. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. But in its wake, something had changed. I could feel it, a subtle shift in my perception that I couldn't quite put into words. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds clearer and more distinct. And there, at the edge of my consciousness, was a presence, alien and familiar all at once. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but a series of impressions, images, and emotions that flooded my mind. In that moment, I understood with terrifying clarity that whatever had been done to me that night in the field wasn't over. The implant wasn't just a passive piece of technology. It was a connection, a link to something vast and incomprehensible. I stumbled out of the barn, my head spinning with this newfound awareness. The sky above seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, the very air around me charged with potential. I wanted to run, to hide, to somehow sever this unwanted connection. But deep down, I knew it was too late. Whatever journey I had been set upon that night in 1976 was far from over. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions and startling revelations. The connection I had felt in the barn didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. I found myself experiencing flashes of insight, moments of clarity that seemed to come from somewhere beyond myself. Sometimes it was mundane. I'd know exactly where to find a lost tool, or sense when one of the animals was about to give birth before any physical signs were present. Other times, it was more profound. I'd wake up from vivid dreams filled with images of distant worlds, strange technologies, and beings that defied description. These visions left me both exhilarated and terrified. Part of me was in awe of the wonders I was being shown, the glimpses into a universe far more vast and complex than I had ever imagined. But another part, the part that still clung to my old life and sense of self, was deeply afraid. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing myself, bit by bit, to something I couldn't fully comprehend. My wife noticed the change in me, of course. How could she not? I'd go from periods of intense focus and almost manic energy to long stretches of silent contemplation. I'd find myself staring off into space, my mind filled with concepts and ideas that I lacked the words to express. She tried to get me to open up, to share what I was experiencing, but how could I explain something I barely understood myself? The gap between us widened, filled with unspoken fears and growing incomprehension. I loved her desperately, but I could feel her slipping away, unable to follow me down this strange and terrifying path I found myself on. As winter settled over the Welsh countryside, bringing with it long nights and biting cold, my experiences intensified. The connection through the implant seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. I began to have what I can only describe as waking visions, moments where the world around me would shift and change, revealing glimpses of something else. It might happen while I was doing something as mundane as feeding the chickens. One second I'd be scattering grain, and the next I'd find myself standing in a vast alien landscape. The sky would be a deep purple, dotted with unfamiliar constellations. Strange crystalline structures would rise around me, pulsing with an inner light. And always, there was a sense of being watched, studied, evaluated. These episodes would last only seconds in real time, but they felt like hours, days, even. I'd come back to myself, gasping and disoriented, the feed bucket dropped at my feet and the chickens clucking in confused alarm. I tried to rationalize these experiences, to tell myself they were just vivid hallucinations brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew better. The clarity, the consistency, the sheer alien nature of what I was seeing. It was all too real, too coherent to be merely a product of my imagination. And with each vision, each glimpse into that other world, I felt myself changing. My perceptions of time and space began to shift. Sometimes I'd blink and realize hours had passed without my notice. Other times, a single moment would stretch on forever, rich with detail and meaning I couldn't fully grasp. The breaking point came on a frigid January night. I had been restless all day, plagued by a growing sense of anticipation that I couldn't shake. As darkness fell, I found myself drawn out of the house. Despite the biting wind and threatening snow, my wife called after me, her voice laced with worry and frustration, but I barely heard her. Something was calling me, pulling me towards the field where it had all begun. As I trudged through the snow-covered pasture, my breath misting in the cold air, I saw them, lights in the sky, just like that night months ago, but this time I wasn't afraid. This time I felt ready. The lights descended slowly, resolving into a craft unlike anything I had ever seen before. It hovered silently, a few feet above the ground, its surface rippling like liquid metal. A beam of soft blue-white light enveloped me, and I felt the familiar sensation of being lifted off my feet. But this time, I remained fully conscious. I watched as the ground fell away beneath me, saw my farm shrink to a tiny speck of light in the darkness, and then I was inside. The interior of the craft defied description, spaces that seemed to fold in on themselves, surfaces that shifted and changed as I looked at them. And the beings, God, the beings, they weren't the little green men of popular culture, nor the tall greys of abduction stories. They were something other, fluid, almost incorporeal, yet undeniably present and aware. They didn't speak, not in any way I could understand, but somehow their intentions, their curiosity, their purpose was communicated directly into my mind. What followed was the experience beyond anything I could have imagined. I was shown visions of worlds beyond count, civilizations that spanned galaxies, technologies that bordered on magic. But more than that, I was given understanding. The implant, I learned, wasn't just a tracking device or a simple monitor. It was a key, a bridge between my limited human consciousness and something far greater. The beings, I hesitate to call them aliens, for that word seems woefully inadequate, had chosen me, yes, but not randomly and not to harm. They were researchers, explorers, seekers of knowledge, and in me they had found a willingness to see beyond the boundaries of my own world. The abduction, the implant, the months of confusion and fear, it had all been preparation, a gradual awakening of latent abilities, an expansion of my consciousness to allow me to comprehend what they needed to share. As the knowledge poured into me, I felt myself changing, expanding. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued me for months melted away, replaced by a sense of wonder and purpose. I understood now that I was part of something far greater than myself, than humanity, than even our concept of life itself. The universe, I learned, was vaster and more complex than we had ever imagined, filled with intelligences and possibilities beyond our wildest dreams. And we, humanity, were on the cusp of taking our first real steps into that larger universe. My role, I realized, was to be a bridge, to help prepare the way for the changes that were coming, the truths that would soon be revealed to all of humanity. As suddenly as it had begun, the experience ended. I found myself back in the snow-covered field, the alien craft nowhere to be seen. But I was changed, irrevocably and profoundly. The knowledge they had shared with me swirled in my mind, a vast ocean of information that I knew would take years, perhaps a lifetime, to fully process and understand. As I trudged back towards the farmhouse, I could see my wife standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. I knew then that my greatest challenge lay ahead. How could I possibly explain what had happened? How could I convey the magnitude of what I had experienced, what I now knew? The implant in my arm no longer felt like an intrusion, but a gift. A constant reminder of the connection I now shared with something greater than myself. But I also understood that this knowledge came with a heavy responsibility. The beings had chosen me for a reason, and I couldn't simply return to my old life as if nothing had happened. As I reached the house, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation to come. I knew my wife might not understand, that she might even think I'd lost my mind, but I had to try, because what I'd learned that night wasn't just about me, or even about humanity. It was about our place in a universe far more wondrous and terrifying than we had ever imagined. And somehow, some way, I had to find a way to share that truth with the world. In the years since that night, I've struggled to come to terms with my experience. There are days when it all feels like a distant dream, when I can almost convince myself that it was just a vivid hallucination brought on by stress or some undiagnosed medical condition. But then I'll catch a glimpse of that silvery implant beneath my skin, or I'll have one of those moments of inexplicable clarity that have become increasingly common, and I'm reminded of the truth. I've learned to live with the knowledge I was given, to balance the mundane realities of running a farm with the cosmic awareness that now colors my perception of everything around me. I've reached out to others who've had similar experiences, forming a small community of individuals who understand what it's like to have touched something beyond our world. We share our stories, our insights, and our fears. Because make no mistake, along with the wonder and the awe, there is fear. Fear of what the future holds, of how humanity will react when the truth finally, inevitably comes to light. But mostly, I find myself filled with a profound sense of anticipation, because I know now that we are not alone, that we are part of something so much bigger than ourselves. And whatever comes next, whatever changes lie ahead for humanity, I know that night in 1976 was just the beginning. The real journey for all of us is yet to come. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.